New Hampshire takes a generally landlord-friendly approach to rent increases, but the state has specific notice requirements and procedural protections that landlords need to follow carefully. The governing law is found in New Hampshire Revised Statutes, Chapter 540 and Chapter 540-A, which cover landlord-tenant obligations and eviction procedures. If you manage rental property in New Hampshire, you have broad pricing freedom, but the process matters. New Hampshire does not have statewide rent control or rent stabilization. There is no state statute that caps rent increases, limits the frequency of increases, or requires landlords to obtain government approval before raising rent. New Hampshire's political philosophy, reflected in its famous motto, "Live free or die," generally favors minimal government regulation of private business, and rent control has not gained meaningful traction in the state legislature. New Hampshire has not enacted a specific preemption statute prohibiting local rent control. This means that municipalities could theoretically attempt to enact their own rent regulations under their home rule authority. However, no New Hampshire municipality has enacted rent control to date. Manchester, Nashua, Concord, Portsmouth, and every other New Hampshire community operate under the same market-based framework. Given the state's political climate, local rent control remains unlikely, but landlords in larger cities should stay aware of local political discussions, particularly in communities where housing affordability has become a topic of public debate. For tenancies at will, which is New Hampshire's term for month-to-month arrangements, the landlord must provide advance written notice before a rent increase takes effect. New Hampshire requires at least 30 days written notice before a rent increase becomes effective. The notice must be a proper written notice, delivered by an authorized method, personal delivery, leaving a copy at the tenant's last and usual place of abode, or sending by certified or registered mail. New Hampshire is very specific about how notices must be delivered, and courts scrutinize the delivery method carefully. Improper delivery is one of the most common reasons landlord actions get challenged in New Hampshire. For rent increase notices, using certified mail or personal delivery with a witness is the safest approach. The notice should clearly state the current rent, the new rent amount, and the effective date. While New Hampshire doesn't prescribe a specific statutory form for rent increase notices, the notice should be clear, professional, and unambiguous. Any confusion about the amount or the effective date can create disputes that are avoidable with precise drafting. For fixed-term leases, the rent is locked in for the duration of the lease term, unless the lease includes a provision allowing mid-term increases. Without such a provision, the landlord must wait until the lease expires to negotiate the new rent. When the lease approaches expiration, the landlord should communicate the proposed new rate well in advance, ideally 60 days or more, to give the tenant time to evaluate the new terms. If the tenant doesn't agree to the new rate, the lease expires at the end of its term. If the tenant remains and the landlord accepts rent, the tenancy converts to a tenancy at will, subject to the 30-day notice requirement for future changes. For week-to-week tenancies, the notice period for rent changes is 7 days, matching the one rental period standard. Now let's cover the restrictions that apply even without rent control. Rent increases cannot be retaliatory. New Hampshire has a specific anti-retaliation provision under RSA 540-13-A that prohibits landlords from taking adverse action, including raising rent, in retaliation for a tenant exercising their legal rights. Protected activities include making a good faith complaint about habitability to the landlord or a government agency, reporting a code violation, exercising any right under the landlord-tenant statutes, and participating in a tenants' organization. New Hampshire's anti-retaliation statute provides that adverse action taken within 6 months of the tenant's protected activity creates a presumption of retaliation. 6 months is a significant protection window. Any rent increase served within that period after a tenant's complaint carries an automatic inference of retaliatory motive. The landlord must then demonstrate that the increase was motivated by legitimate business reasons unrelated to the tenant's complaint. The consequences of a retaliatory rent increase in New Hampshire can include the invalidation of the increase, liability for damages, and attorney's fees. A finding of retaliation can also undermine the landlord's credibility in any related legal proceedings. The 6-month presumption period means that landlords need to be very careful about the timing of rent increases relative to tenant complaints. Rent increases also cannot be discriminatory. Under the Federal Fair Housing Act and the New Hampshire Law Against Discrimination, found in RSA Chapter 354 AA, landlords cannot raise rent based on a tenant's race, color, religion, national origin, sex, sexual orientation, disability, familial status, marital status, or age. New Hampshire's anti-discrimination protections are broader than the Federal Fair Housing Act. The inclusion of sexual orientation, marital status, and age provides additional categories of protection. The New Hampshire Commission for Human Rights investigates fair housing complaints and can take enforcement action, including ordering damages, injunctive relief, and civil penalties. A discriminatory rent increase can result in significant liability. One area where New Hampshire's law is particularly relevant to rent increases is the state's limitation on security deposits. Under RSA 540-A:6, the security deposit cannot exceed 1 month's rent or $100, whichever is greater. This is one of the lowest security deposit caps in the country and has a practical implication for rent increases. As the rent increases, the maximum allowable security deposit also increases. However, landlords cannot retroactively collect additional deposit from an existing tenant solely because the rent has gone up. Any change to the deposit amount would need to be negotiated as part of a new or renewed agreement. From a practical standpoint, New Hampshire's rental market is concentrated in several key areas with distinct dynamics. The southern tier of the state, including Manchester, Nashua, Salem, and Londonderry, has the strongest rental demand, driven by proximity to the Boston metropolitan area. Many residents of southern New Hampshire commute to Greater Boston for employment, and the rental market in this region reflects Boston area demand patterns. Rents in southern New Hampshire are significantly higher than in the rest of the state, but remain more affordable than comparable communities in Massachusetts, which is part of their appeal. Landlords in this region generally have strong pricing power and can implement regular annual increases. Manchester, the state's largest city, has a diverse rental market with both older multifamily housing stock and newer construction. The city has experienced economic revitalization in recent years, with growing healthcare, technology, and manufacturing sectors. Rents have increased steadily, and demand remains strong. Nashua, the state's second-largest city, has a similar profile, with strong demand driven by Boston commuters and local employment. The rental market is competitive, and landlords can typically implement meaningful annual increases. The Seacoast region, including Portsmouth, Dover, and Rochester, has an active rental market driven by tourism, the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and a vibrant cultural scene. Portsmouth in particular has a tight housing market with limited inventory and strong demand, resulting in rents that are among the highest in the state. The Naval Shipyard and related defense contractors provide stable employment that supports consistent rental demand. Concord, the state capital, has a moderate rental market driven by state government employment, healthcare, and regional services. Rents are lower than in southern New Hampshire or the Seacoast, and increases tend to be more conservative. The Lakes region, including Laconia and surrounding communities, and the North Country, including Berlin, Littleton, and other northern communities, have softer rental markets. Tourism provides seasonal demand, but year-round rental demand is more limited, particularly in communities that have experienced population decline. Landlords in these areas need to be strategic about rent increases to avoid vacancies. Hanover and Lebanon, home to Dartmouth College and the Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center, have a unique market driven by the college and the medical center. Student housing near Dartmouth follows the academic calendar, and the medical center provides stable professional rental demand. Rents in the Upper Valley area are higher than what the community size might suggest, driven by institutional demand. Keene, home to Keene State College, has a student-influenced rental market. Plymouth, home to Plymouth State University, has a similar dynamic on a smaller scale. Rent adjustments in these markets typically follow the academic calendar. One best practice for New Hampshire landlords, given the 6-month anti-retaliation presumption, maintain a regular schedule of rent increases that is consistent across all your properties. If you raise rent annually for all tenants at a predictable time, such as at lease renewal, the pattern itself demonstrates that increases are routine business decisions rather than reactions to any individual tenant's behavior. A landlord who raises rent for every tenant by 3 to 5% each year at renewal is in a much stronger position than one who only raises rent for specific tenants at unpredictable times. Another best practice: for properties in southern New Hampshire that compete with the greater Boston market, track Boston area rent trends alongside local data. Many of your tenants chose New Hampshire specifically because it's more affordable than Massachusetts, and keeping your rents competitive relative to both the local market and the Boston area alternative helps retain tenants. However, southern New Hampshire's inherent advantages, no state income tax, no state sales tax, lower insurance costs, mean that tenants who work in Boston have strong financial reasons to stay even with regular rent increases. New Hampshire's lack of income tax and sales tax is itself a competitive advantage for the state's rental market. These tax savings effectively increase tenants' disposable income, which supports their ability to absorb rent increases. Landlords in southern New Hampshire can factor this financial advantage into their pricing strategy. Tenants who save thousands of dollars annually on taxes can often afford rents that would be out of reach if they also had Massachusetts-level tax obligations. For landlords near the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard and other military-adjacent areas, understanding BAH rate changes is important. Military tenants' housing budgets are tied to their basic allowance for housing, and pricing should account for these rates. BAH rates are adjusted annually, and keeping your rent competitive relative to the allowance ensures that your property remains attractive to military tenants. For New Hampshire landlords who participate in the Housing Choice Voucher Program, rent increases must be approved by the local housing authority. The authority evaluates whether the proposed rent is reasonable by comparing it to comparable unassisted units in the market. Submit increase requests well in advance of the desired effective date to allow time for the review process. New Hampshire requires landlords to return the security deposit within 30 days of the tenant vacating. Given the state's low deposit cap, 1 month's rent or $100, landlords should be particularly diligent about the return process, as the consequences of failing to return even a small deposit can include penalties and attorney's fees. For the complete guide to New Hampshire rent increase laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com and subscribe to our channel for every state in our series.